China-U.S. relationship is certainly one of the most consequential in the world today. But relations are being put to the test with the tensions over both trade and security. After 40 years of engagement and successful diplomatic ties, how will the world's two largest economies find the common ground to stay on the track of peaceful coexistence? How should President Trump's China policy be evaluated? And how should China's road ahead be viewed as the nation enjoys the fruits of 4 decades of reform and vows to embrace greater opening up? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the first half of the show by Avery Goldstein, Director of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania. And the second half, when we come back, we'll be joined by James Note, Senior Fellow at the World Policy Institute. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to our dialogue, Professor.
Thank you for having me on the program.
Given the uncertainty of the bilateral relationship, no one says it's an easy job to redefine or reset the China policy. But what kind of China would come across as a country that you study for so many years? Is it more about the competition or going back to the rivalry of the Cold War?
Well, I don't think it's going to, the relationship will not be exactly the way the Cold War was between the United States and the Soviet Union. The world is different. Certainly China is different than the Soviet Union was from the American viewpoint. But there are some similarities. I think the similarities are really twofold. One is that there are some fundamental conflicting interests between the two countries in terms of their role in the world, in terms of their overlapping interests in a region. In this case, it would be East Asia as opposed to Central Europe. And also some sense of rivalry in terms of global governance issues, in terms of resolving international disputes in third areas. There are disagreements about the role that each country would play. The major difference is there's no longer a competition to establish a governing ideology for the world, as there was between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And the other major, probably most important difference is the economic interaction between the U.S. and China, which was simply absent from the U.S.-Soviet relationship.
Avery, two things that made China different from the former Soviet Union. During the Cold War, there was a zero trade and investment between these two superpowers. There weren't any people-to-people exchanges. However, today, what scares Chinese scholars and perhaps some of the American scholars of international studies across the aisle, do you think this is a very bad beginning, something ominous and indicates something very badly for people-to-people exchanges? Because people like Professor Zhu Feng have been very friendly to the United States, have been very friendly to these values that the Americans stand for.
I do think this is a bad situation, and I fear it may get worse. And the bottom line for me is the reasoning behind the idea that his visa should be revoked, and other scholars as well. Because if the FBI, in fact, has evidence that there was some criminal wrongdoing, that's one thing. But if it's purely the notion that allowing scholars from China, especially in non-sensitive areas, international relations, political science, that simply going to conferences entails unacceptable access to the American higher education system, to me that's inappropriate. So the question really is, does the FBI have any reason to believe that there were justifiable grounds for doing this? I've seen no evidence. And as you say, they seem to have selected, in the case of Zhu Feng, someone who's a well-regarded scholar and who has independent views. I wouldn't say he's pro-American. I would say he thinks for himself. Sometimes that means he points out where he agrees with things the U.S. is doing. Sometimes he points out China's interests. So that's what scholars should be doing, and they should be doing that free of the political interference of governments on either side. And in this case, it's interference from the United States government without any obvious justification. This will be a problem, as you said. One of the differences between the U.S.-China relationship and the U.S.-Soviet relationship is the rather rich network of exchanges, people-to-people exchanges, as well as the economic interaction. And I think one of the risks the relationship runs now is that long-standing concerns about military security disagreements, which go all the way back to the 1990s, this is not new, are now being compounded with concerns that the people-to-people relationship as well as the economic relationship could have security implications. And that's going to make the relationship much more difficult to manage.
Philadelphia is a historic city with a lot of stories on the founding principles that the founding father of the United States stood for. Now, do you think that this presidency, this government of the United States would probably redefine the U.S.-China relationship at the cost of the founding principles? Because we were talking about the free flow of ideas and human resources across the traditional boundaries of nation states in the age of globalization. Because much of what this government in the White House does is called by some Chinese and indeed observers in other parts of the world as an attempt at deglobalization. Are we going back? And will the founding principles of the United States be jeopardized as a result?
Well, I don't think the founding principles of the United States will be jeopardized as a result of the current administration's policies. I do think that the current administration's policies are calling into question the commitment to an open international trading order and other aspects of globalization. But of course, the pushback against globalization is not just in the United States, and to be fair to the Trump administration, not just about the Trump administration. When Hillary Clinton was running for president, she, as well as Donald Trump, indicated they would withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, would not push for that, and there was going to be some adjustments made in the international order because of unhappiness with what was seen as an uneven, unfair playing field internationally. So I think that's going to continue, but I do think that this administration's policy has been unusually forward-leaning or disruptive on these issues, and I suspect that whoever becomes the next president, whether it's a new president in 2020 or 2024, that the next president is likely to try to moderate the American position, because I think the open international trading order, at least in some respects, benefits all major trading partners, and it's a question of figuring out how to make the rules fair enough for everybody to see their interests served.
You wrote a book called Rising to the Challenge, China's Grand Strategy and International Security in 2005. Would you give your comments in this context about what China is, how you define China, how do you look at the nature of the competition between these two governments?
So I'll tie these two things together. The idea that there's this, as you put it, a struggle to define global leadership. I think each country faces that challenge quite differently. I think the challenge for the United States, I'll start there, is how to adjust to a world in which the United States will not have such a huge advantage in terms of capabilities, and therefore will have to adjust somewhat to accommodating other countries' interests in ways it didn't really have to in the past decades, especially since the end of the Cold War. I think the challenge on the Chinese side is figuring out how to play a larger role on the world stage in a way that does not appear to be an attempt to replace the United States as the global leader or to dictate to other countries what they should do. So in terms of that book that you mentioned and China's grand strategy, I think since the end of the Cold War, I would argue now, it's been a few years, it's been more than a decade since that book came out, that in fact China's had a pretty consistent agenda, call it a grand strategy, whatever you want, which is after the Cold War ended, China no longer faced the kind of pressing security threats that it did from first the United States, later the Soviet Union. That problem was solved. And so China's leaders, the Communist Party, turned its attention to realizing the really more than a century-old dream of Chinese nationalists, which was this task of rejuvenation of China, bringing it back to being a true great power and a prosperous society, an advanced industrial society. And I think that's what has been the vision that's motivated China's foreign policy since the early 90s. But it's gone through three different stages. First, under Deng Xiaoping, while he was still actively leading, it was Taoguangyanghui, keep a low profile, try to build up China's capabilities without ruffling other feathers, so that others wouldn't worry that China was going to infringe on their interests. But by the mid-1990s, I think people were beginning to recognize China's ascent and began to worry about the role that China would play. And so under Jiang Zemin, we go into the second period under Jiang Zemin, and the first 5 years under Hu Jintao, you see a China that is trying to reassure other countries that, yes, we can't just keep a low profile. People notice we're rising, but reassure other countries that China's, as you know, rise will be peaceful, that China will be a responsible participant in international affairs, and that others need not worry about China's growing economic or military capabilities. Then I think in the last years under Hu Jintao, and especially under Jiang Zemin, the approach is a bit different, and that's because by the second half of Hu Jintao's terms in office, others were becoming concerned about China, what was seen as a more assertive China, especially in the East China Sea and South China Sea. And this led to pushback. The Obama administration's rebalanced Asia, and then later leads to the Trump administration's new national security strategy. But I think when Xi Jinping becomes the leader of the Communist Party and president of the country, I think his approach is we still want China's rejuvenation, but it's not going to be enough simply to reassure others, because they now have concerns and we can't alleviate those concerns. They will not believe any longer that China's rise will necessarily be peaceful. And so I think China has continued to try to reassure others, but has done a bit more. It's also tried to play a more active role through the Belt and Road Initiative and through other international efforts where China's trying to say, here's the contribution China can make that's constructive, that is not simply trying to tell people China won't be a threat, but that China's going to make some contributions to reforming the international order, obviously along the lines of what's China's interests.
I'm the author of Who Misunderstands China. Probably from the very beginning of China's massive disarmament in the early 1980s under Deng Xiaoping's leadership, China had been misunderstood. China wanted to be a major power, protected by its own army. Look at the long continental maritime borders. China really needs to have its own military build-up. But then when China, after a period of Taoguang Yanghui, really comes back to the center stage with its own ideas on modernization, the military build-up, we start to scare the world. And from the very beginning, the Chinese argue we had been misunderstood. Do you think misunderstanding is indeed a serious danger that threatens to, further erode the limited trust, if any, between our two countries?
The problem you've identified, international relations scholars often label as security dilemma. Countries do things in their own interest to try to protect their interests, and other countries see those efforts as potentially threatening. And so that's normal. That happens frequently among countries when they're not allies. But in fact, misunderstanding can aggravate the security dilemma, make it more intense. And I do think that's the problem that is faced right now, that every action that China takes that it believes is simply protecting Chinese interests tends to be interpreted as threatening to others by the United States and some countries in East Asia. That's not to excuse everything China does. I think there are some clear disagreements about whether China's activities with regard to freedom of navigation, freedom of overflight, whether those are appropriate, whether China's position, for example, on the South China Sea is sustainable, justifiable. But to resolve those kinds of disagreements and misunderstandings, it would be a lot better to pursue dialogue rather than using military forces to send signals, which is what's happening right now. Each side is doing things, believing that they can use their actions to send messages, to identify, so that the other side will understand their interests. The problem is both the side sending those kinds of signals by taking actions, as well as the country observing what's being done, can misinterpret what the meaning is of those actions. And so it's useful to have dialogue between the two sides to try to hash out some of these concerns, whether it's in the context of bilateral negotiations or multilateral negotiations, or in the context of international law under UNCLOS.
Thank you so much, Professor Avery Goldstein. That's this part of our talk with a famous China hand, an expert of international studies and global politics. We were discussing the impact of China's rise and what it means for the two countries, the United States and China. We did this interview in the University of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. Thank you for being with us. How does China's economic development help change its relations with the world?
China's economic development has, in some sense, made it more challenging for China to have good relations because so many countries now are facing competitive challenges from China's exports.
You are one of those who stand for cooperation and competition instead of a confrontation, right?
As long as there's not a fundamentally aggressive activity, there's no need for confrontation. To develop a clear idea of what kinds of rules we should have for the global system. We need somebody with a broad vision who can look beyond the past, because we've had a fairly successful and fairly peaceful period since World War II in the world order.
Welcome to Dialogue, Professor James Note. Let's take a closer look at the charisma, popularity, and the leadership style of President Trump, the presidency itself. Now, in one of your published commentaries, you wrote, President Trump's political theater follows a pattern. He creates a crisis and then tries to become the hero for solving the crisis. While crises create bargaining leverage, they also have costs and unintended consequences. That's what you said,
yes.
I quote. So what would be your estimate of the costs and unintended consequences for Trump's political and economic policies?
Well, for example, in putting the tariffs against China beginning last year, his intent was to gain bargaining leverage, to get certain concessions from China. However, the damage, of course, was inflicted on both countries, partly by China's retaliatory tariffs, but even simply by the American tariffs themselves, because they raised the cost of many imported products for American businesses and consumers. And so I don't think Trump himself has a very sophisticated idea of what the interactions are in a political economy when you start to interfere with trade, when you start to impose costs on trade. He hasn't worked it out for himself. He just thinks you need to act strongly, and by acting strongly, you will get the other side to concede. But some of the demands that he's making, I think, are things that are very hard for China to concede to, and they're not formulated in such a way that they could be general rules that everyone would follow, but are just specific demands that he wants China to adhere to. And I think what's really needed is a broad set of rules that everyone could adhere to.
Core issue between the two biggest economies, I'm afraid, is what has caused the trade imbalance. The Chinese account says loud and clear, look, it's that we have saved a lot and you spend too much. And therefore, it's not China's fault. Besides, those who contribute most to the trade deficit on China's side are actually 6% of them are American multinationals in China.
Right.
So what do you make of the pros and cons, pull and push concerning the reasons behind the trade imbalance from your perspective?
Well, there's a couple of ways to look at this. One is that it's predominantly the United States that has a significant trade imbalance with China. You know, many of the other major countries, major trading partners of China, don't have a significant trade imbalance or even have a trade surplus. So the United States is the country that has the big deficit with China. We have a trade imbalance with many European countries and so forth. So the second thing to keep in mind is American history. For 2.5 centuries, the United States has run a trade imbalance. That is, we've been a net importer of capital and a net importer of goods since the 18th century, with 2 exceptions, the World Wars and the Great Depression. During the World Wars, Europe and other countries destroyed their own capital and then started to import American capital to replace it. And so during that period, we were a net exporter. We're a very big continental country with a relatively small population, growing, of course, through history, but we had lots of capital needs. So we're always importing capital from abroad to develop our country. It's a kind of a natural pattern based on resource endowments that the United States had. So I think there's both structural reasons and also just the long historical reason why the United States has tended to be a net importer. And it happens today the major source of those imports are China, but in past it's been Japan, or it's been Britain, or it's been other countries. I would tend to agree with the broad notion that we would have this situation no matter what because of structural factors, and it isn't necessarily something we need to be deeply concerned with.
Without exceptions, all American presidential hopefuls said on the campaign trail they want to reduce taxes, and that, do you think, has contributed to the trade imbalance? Because you...
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yes, because, you know...
Tax reduction. That's the politics, right?
Right.
We have fallen victim to American domestic politics.
In a sense, yes, because anytime you have, you're cutting taxes without commensurate cutting of spending, which is what's going on, then we have to borrow more. And the U.S. government, of course, is one of the world's greatest borrowers, probably the world's greatest borrower. And much of that borrowing now comes from abroad. Again, China's a major source, Japan is a source, Arab countries.
We have $3 trillion U.S. dollars,
exactly,
including dollar-denominated assets.
And whenever you're borrowing from abroad, that also creates a net demand for foreign products. It's just the nature of the balance of payments. Again, it's a structural feature of the economy. It's not based on policy, except that it does follow from the underlying problem of excessive borrowing.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's another contributing macroeconomic factor.
Recently, amid the tensions over aircraft subsidies, the U.S. has threatened to impose tariffs on about $11 billion U.S. worth of goods from the European Union, and the EU is moving fast to launch trade talks. How serious is the U.S. tariff trade for American allies in Europe?
Well, the aircraft subsidies is one area where it is, but I would say actually the biggest conflict potentially is the automobile imports, because Trump has raised that as one area. He said several times that he's considering a 25% tariff on all auto imports, and that is a huge component of the American economy. It's about $350 billion a year. It's bigger than all the tariffs that have been put on China. And remember, I mentioned tariffs are not just, Trump seems to think that tariffs are just a tax on foreigners, but actually it's a tax on the American consumer. In the case of automobiles, which is a big purchase item for most American consumers, if we were to raise the tariffs, or also in aircraft parts, the price of cars could increase 15–20% in the United States. What would that do to the industry? A lot of people would just stop buying cars. It could be devastating, not only for reducing imports, but actually reducing domestic consumption. It could cause a major recession. But I don't think Trump thinks these things through. He's not a sophisticated economist, and he doesn't listen to any sophisticated economists. He doesn't have any among his advisors. So I don't think he's aware of the potential damage that protectionism can have on the American economy.
The issue, Jim, is that the tariffs that President Trump is likely to impose won't necessarily help Chinese to reconsider their purchase of the automobiles from the United States. They would rather turn to Japan and Germany for their cars. Second, do you think that the tariff policy of President Trump will help regenerate jobs, bring jobs back to the United States? Do you think cities like Detroit could be rejuvenated as a result?
Not really, because most of the big manufacturers in the United States have already gone global with their manufacturing supply chains. So they're already depending on free trade to source a lot of the components of whatever they're manufacturing. Automobiles is a great example of this. Recently, Trump talked about even closing the border with Mexico. If he were to do that, the consequences on American industry and jobs would be immediate and negative, because so many vital parts are only made now in Mexico for all the American auto industries. Things like car seats, for example. We don't make them anymore. We import them all. So if you have one part missing from your global supply chain, the whole industry shuts down until they can replace that. So companies have gotten so used to the notion that they can have free trade to buy from wherever they need to, whatever supplies they need. Now, if you start throwing arbitrary tariffs into those supply chains, it can be very disruptive. And I don't think it'll save jobs. I think that most economists think, and some of the evidence has already shown, it's more likely to cost jobs in the short run.
While taking a look at President Trump's many tariff threats towards the U.S. major trading partners, China, the EU, Japan, Canada, what is your analysis of his strategy? It seems that such unilateralism or protectionism is prevailing. Look at the steady approval rating of always 40% something for him, staunch support for him, whatever he says, whatever he does. There is always this big population who wants to support his presidency. Do you think this is likely to diminish because there are so many investigations against your president at this moment, legal problems, whether he has violated laws.
Even though his support has been fairly steady, it has never been a majority of the population. And so the only reason why he won the election last time is the Democratic vote was somewhat suppressed. A lot of people didn't come out to vote. In the last election, in 2018, for the congressional election, there was a huge mobilization of Democratic voters, many who previously hadn't voted. He may face that again next time, because in 2016, he was a kind of unknown factor. By 2020 election, he will be well known, and his 40% core base is not enough for him to win, particularly if the Democratic candidate can mobilize much of their base, as happened in 2018. The second thing that's important is there are a lot of signs that the American economy may have a recession either this year or next. If there's a recession before the 2020 election, it's very unlikely that Trump could win re-election.
How does China's economic development help change its relations with the world, Jim?
Well, I think China's economic development has, in some sense, made it more challenging for China to have good relations because so many countries now are facing competitive challenges from China's exports. You know, 10, 20 years ago, China was competitive in things like textiles and footwear and some labor-intensive products. And now China's expanding into a more full range of exports, including a lot of high-tech equipment, most recently telecommunications, electronics, and so forth. And that's starting to challenge a wider range of products in other countries that leads to competitive pressures and arguments that Chinese competition has to be confronted in some way.
There are allegations about the debt trap in countries that benefit from China's investment. Therefore, skeptical voices in the United States say we want to see China's integration with the rest of the world would be more of a blessing than a threat to the U.S. national security. What are your thoughts on the route that may ensure China's smooth integration without causing clashes or head-on collision, particularly between the U.S. and China?
Well, I think it goes back to what we talked about near the beginning, which is to develop a clear idea of what kinds of rules we should have for the global system. We need somebody with a broad vision who can look beyond the past, because we've had a fairly successful and fairly peaceful period since World War II in the world order. But conditions are changing. With the high-tech developments, there's a lot of new opportunities. There's new challenges with the rise of terrorism in the world. There are new police and security challenges that need to be shared across many countries. And so I think it's going to take some creative and thoughtful leadership on both sides of the Pacific to better manage that relationship. I myself don't think that there's an inherently necessary conflict between the United States and China. However, I do think there's increasingly areas of tension that are going to be hard to resolve, particularly unless you have very forward-looking leadership that really appreciates the dimensions of global problems today and recognizes that things are changing in fundamental ways with the development of high-tech industries in particular.
So, Jim, you are one of those who stand for cooperation and competition instead of a confrontation, right?
Well, I think as long as there's not a fundamentally aggressive activity, there's no need for confrontation. I mean, I can think of circumstances under which there would be a confrontation if China took some egregious action. But in terms of economic expansion or investment, these are things which are legitimate in the world order, and there's no reason I'd think the United States to confront China because they're investing abroad or because they're trading abroad. I mean, these are certainly acceptable and reasonable behaviors for any country, and the fact that China's good at it and competitive now in and of itself shouldn't cause alarm in the United States.
Thank you so much. I do appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it, Ray.